This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. Capitalism is a word that I personally try to avoid. It has so many different meanings, so many different connotations, that it often brings more confusion than clarity. But in the most general sense, we really do live in a capitalist world. If Karl Marx was alive today, he would point out that there are no peasant societies based on serfdom. There are no slave-owning societies. There are certainly no communist utopias. Almost wherever in the world Marx would go, he would describe what he sees as a version of capitalism. So how is capitalism serving us? That is, of course, an impossibly broad question to answer here. There are so many sub-questions, perhaps most pressingly, the relationship between capitalism and climate change. An important topic, but not the topic of today. The topic of today is the economic performance of capitalism. And more specifically, the question of whether capitalism is inevitably leading to greater and greater economic inequality. Now, of course, there are people on the left and the right who think that this is an irrelevant question. There are those who say that inequality does not matter if everybody is getting better off. And then there are those who, like Marx, say that no amount of relative equality in the wages and incomes will ever be genuine equality under a system where some own the factories and the machines and others do the work. But many of us do care about economic inequality within capitalism. Many of us do not think that it is sustainable for inequality to increase forever, giving the rich more and more power compared to the rest of us. And not many of us are ready to abandon this question before the fulfillment of a certain kind of post-capitalist utopia. So I've been long wanting to find people who are able to navigate these tricky waters, and there are very few people as suited to the task, I believe, as Branko Milanović. He's author of books such as Global Inequality, Capitalism Alone, and Visions of Inequality. He was born in communist Yugoslavia, and I really find him someone who's able to commentate on capitalism without any indoctrinated faith, but also with a deep appreciation of the limits of its alternatives. We discuss a variety of issues in this episode, such as why did British capitalism early on, just like Marx observed, create a hugely unequal society? And why did this change during the 20th century capitalism in Britain and other rich countries? Did this happen because or despite of capitalism? And why was there an uptick in inequality within rich countries, especially the US, after the 80s? We also discuss global inequality and why, to the surprise of many globalization critics, globalization has led into a sharp decrease in global inequality on some measures, and we discuss the trickiness of deciding on the right measure. In the end, I also pick Milanovic's brain on his experience being born in Yugoslavia, asking if Yugoslavia could serve as a source of inspiration for people who are angry at capitalism but disillusions at the failures of centrally planned economies like USSR and China under Mao. If you enjoyed this and other conversations of the On Humans podcast, please do consider showing some support. Do subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so yet. And do consider joining the wonderful group of people who are actually supporting my work on patreon.com/onhumans. Finally, I want to say that this is an episode where we discuss a lot of numbers. And of course, visualizations would help a lot. So I prepared a Substack post, which you can find again in the show notes, which has a lot of the relevant graphs and which actually has also more data than we discuss in this episode. There is a further reason why this might be relevant. I do want to apologize if this episode does have a bit of a worse audio quality than is usual. So if that does bother you, do consider just reading instead of listening. But I hope it doesn't, and I hope that you enjoy this episode with Branko Milanović. Professor Branko Milanović, welcome to On Humans.
Thank you very much, Ilari. It's a pleasure to be there.
You write about historical trends in economic inequality, both actual changes, but also more recently about how different intellectuals at different times have thought about economic inequality. And I thought that maybe we could try to kind of join these themes by looking at the ways that the context where different writers have written have influenced them. And I think an obvious place to start would be maybe Karl Marx. What kind of a world was Karl Marx living in?
Okay, so I think, Ilari, it's a very good question. If you look at Marx, he lived from 1818 to 1883. And his main interest was, for the reasons that we know, was England, because it was the most advanced country in the development of capitalism. Actually, I would say Great Britain. And that was the time where he had, of course, lots of data, and anybody who has even sort of, skimmed through Capital knows that there are lots of numbers, there are lots of quotes of government reports and so on. but he did not have the information that we have today. So what we can now do is actually look at how inequality evolved. And to some extent, he was influenced by that, even if he didn't have the data that we have. And the basic story is that there was a significant increase in income inequality in the UK until probably there were some questions there whether it was at the very end of the 19th century or it went up to the beginning of the 20th. The wealth inequality, wealth concentration was extraordinarily high, and I think it's probably one of the highest wealth concentrations in modern times.
Yeah, it's striking graph. I think I saw this in your book of how the wealth concentration in England or the UK, I can't remember, develops. And if I remember right, it starts from like in pre-industrial England, it was like 40%, which is very high. The top 1% had 40% of all wealth. It goes all the way up to 70. But there is the irony that it starts this dramatic decrease right when Marx dies, right?
So then, of course, currently, just to give to the readers an idea, current is 20%. So we had, during Marx's own time, we have had both an increase in income inequality in England and even more tremendous accumulation and concentration of wealth. So this is the background against which he worked. However, I have to say that also the data on wages do show consistent, even if not continual. I mean, continual meaning from year to year. That was not happening, but a consistent increase in real wages. So real wages went up by approximately less than 1% annually in real terms. So it is not to be dismissed. So he had also in front of him the modest increase in real wages in England. But you know what was actually interesting, which we have really to sort of adjust our expectations when we talk about England. England had a very dramatic industrial revolution. It had a huge number of people who were basically chased from land, as you know, with enclosures and the rest. And that Marx describes very well. But that was really, we are talking about a period of the very ending of the previous century and the early 19th century. They were chased from land. They actually had no option either to work for basically 10 or 12 hours a day, including children. As you know, their child labor was very common, or to become beggars, or to become vagrants, and then to actually end up either at poor houses, being mistreated, or being actually punished and put in jail for not working. So, you know, when he discusses the position of the poor people, or what he then calls also the reserve army of labor, what he calls the nomadic population, he's really focusing on large groups. These were not marginal groups, large groups that basically had no choice. And then when he describes people, it's a little bit like let's to put it in current terms, it's a little bit like people in Laos today, where actually you basically have people in dorms, as they had people in England, living in dorms, and then basically working 12 hours a day. And then you go back to a pub and you get drunk, you sleep, the next day you work, and you do that for 6 days. So, you know, that part of the British industrialization, I mentioned that in the book, just to finish there. Tocqueville, who was a big admirer of British democracy and liberalism, was tasked by the French Academy of Sciences of Cherbourg to go in 1850 to look at the poverty in England. And he wrote a small memoir called Pauperism. How is it that England, which is so much more advanced economically and politically, has such deep poverty, which France didn't have, because the French peasantry was generally, after the revolution, landowning. So, in other words, that peasantry at least had food, wine, enough, stuff to survive and roof over the head. But the English, really, those who were actually chased from land, had basically nothing. And this was this nomadic floating population of which Marx writes quite a lot. And that was, I think, the reality of 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. So that too we have to take into account, even if the formal wage went up by 1% a year.
what do you think then about people who, I've actually even published a small episode with economist Brad DeLong titled "Was Marx Right About History but Wrong About the Future?" I think it's very common for people to suggest this one way or another. We actually didn't focus on income inequality, but let me give you a kind of quick sketch of what many people might say, which is that, look, Marx observes this very dramatic transformation in England, which really doesn't benefit the average person almost at all. It creates this massive accumulation of capital where the richest 1% own 70% of everything. He's absolutely right in describing this as an unsustainable system. But what he fails to acknowledge is that within that broadly capitalist system, you might have anything like the next 100, 150 years where it's just where everybody gets better off, all the boats are lifted, and not only are the workers getting better off materially, but also income inequality and wealth inequality becomes dramatically smaller. And this is something that Marx failed to see, and this kind of disproves the Marxian doctrine that capitalism is doomed to failure. Do you think that's an accurate, would it be a fair rebuttal, or what do you think?
Yeah, let me say there is elements of fairness there, but there are also elements, I think, of misinterpretation. Let me say what I think is correct in that. The description of the wrenching nature of British industrialization is definitely true. It has been confirmed by any people. Marx was, after all, not the only one. You had whole literature in those days writing about it.
I mean, even fiction writers like Dickens.
Yes, of course. I mean, only take Dickens. Actually, I had to read Dickens in elementary school. It was a compulsory reading.
Was this in Yugoslavia?
Yes, and we had maybe I was in the 4th grade or 5th grade. I remember Dickens. I think it was The Bleak House. Actually, honestly, I could not finish the book. The book is so deeply disturbing for a child. It just gave me this horrible feeling of British industrialization, and it was not made up. Okay. So that part, I think we all agree. And of course, it's Brad Delsky, is a economic historian, that has been substantiated by lots of numbers. Now, when we come to the future, the situation there is, I think, a little bit different. Marx, if you look at Marx claimed to have discovered historical laws of the evolution of human society, of basically succession of socioeconomic formations. So, as you know, I will not repeat that, but the next formation after capitalism, in his view, would be socialism. That does not mean that socialism came in 1917. That was the claim, but it does. He remains very uncommitted. When would socialism come? So it's actually, there is a sort of a great historical sweep. And he could be right that into 2227, Now, where actually he was, I think, wrong is that he could not imagine that capitalism would be able to transform itself in the way that you describe it, in such sustainable and very dramatic way over the last 100 years. I think that he genuinely did not believe in ability of capitalism to actually transform itself, to let the state redistribute 30, 40, 50% of GDP. So that's something that I believe it just does not enter.
But hold on, isn't it true that even if you look at pre-tax inequality, it's much less now?
I agree. But that also is transformation of capitalism through greater education. That's, of course, crucial. And even greater ownership, including obviously housing ownership and even some small financial assets. Where capitalism has not changed, and we may talk about that later, is really in the huge concentration of financial capital. It is not, of course, it has not reached the level of England in 1910, but it's very high concentration. But I think what Marx could not envisage is that capitalism would really redistribute lots of income and would broaden education to the extent that it has brought. However, even on that, you can actually have a repartee. So the argument has been made that the advent of social democracy, of redistribution, and a much greater role of the state was the result of the strength of the socialist movement, threat of the Soviet Union, power of communist parties and other socialist parties linked with trade unions after World War I. So then the situation gets complicated. Maybe that capitalism actually transformed itself because it was afraid of the Marxist revolution. So then it becomes a more complicated story. So had there not been a possibility or significant likelihood of Marxist revolution, maybe capitalism would have continued on this track of the 19th century. So, the situation is not totally clear cut. Despite all of that, I would say that Marx did not anticipate the role of the state and ability to redistribute both income and education so broadly, and that he was wrong that the socialist economists, in the little that he wrote, because he wrote very little about it, that socialist economy would be able to function under the centralized system and that would actually be more efficient than capitalist economies. So I would say, yes, these are two. In one case, it is a mistake. In the other case, I think it's an omission, or maybe they are both mistakes. But I would agree with that.
I don't want to stay too long on this one point, but I am fascinated because I'm Finnish and I have a lot of respect for the capacity of redistributive policies to create a society which I think is better than it would have been without them. But I'm also fascinated by the cases of some economies like Taiwan, where if you look at the income inequality, let's take some classic thing like the Gini coefficient. You look at Taiwanese Gini coefficient before tax and after tax, and it's pretty much the same. So there really doesn't seem to be government redistribution. And by the way, I think what's more important, the Taiwanese Gini coefficient is very close to the Finnish one. It's very low.
Yeah, Taiwanese actually is very low. I like to use the example of Taiwan because Taiwan redistributes, I think, like 15% of GDP to achieve the same disposable income inequality like Canada, which redistributes 40%. And the reason is that Taiwan starts, the market income inequality is relatively low. So if you actually had very low market income inequality, which means if everybody had more or less the same amounts of what is called, I don't like the term, but just for your listeners, I will use it, human capital, which means similar levels of skills and relatively similar property income, you would actually not need to redistribute that much afterwards.
But isn't this an example of, I mean, I agree that it's a really interesting example. It's a very stimulating example. I don't know if it can be replicated. There's something very culturally particular about Taiwan, but I'm wondering just that this could be used, I think, by Marx's harshest critics as an example that you can have a capitalist system which generates a very low level of inequality with a lot of prosperity without government transfers, without any Marxist kind of touch behind it. I'm sure that maybe education would be the answer. There's a government-sponsored education. But what do you think? Do you think that would be the kind of a golden argument in this?
No, there is no golden argument, Larry, because to every argument you have counter argument. Of course, you can say, yes, that's true for Taiwan, but it's true also because they nationalized Japanese owned property when Japan left. And that was actually not the only case. I mean, I'm from Serbia. Serbia distributed properties which were owned by rich Ottomans at the liberation of the country in 1830, redistributed to peasants. So it became an extremely egalitarian, like Bulgaria as well, extremely egalitarian peasant society. But look, the advantage there. It is easy for you to become extremely egalitarian if you take assets that belong to somebody else and then redistribute that more or less equally to everybody. So it was not totally endogenous capitalist development.
Very interesting.
I don't think history gives us totally unambiguous lessons. We can broadly say, and I was trying to be very broad in what I said about Marx being wrong or what he omitted, but it's not that clear cut. That history is not that clear cut.
Well, let's see if we can salvage a more nuanced version of another thinker. So if we still focus, and I don't want to focus only on the rich West and rich East Asia, but if we still focus for a while on these on rich countries, one of the major thinkers that you touch upon, who is a kind of theorizer of this era of what's sometimes called the Great Leveling, so this increased prosperity and decreased inequality, is Kuznets, right? And maybe you could introduce quickly, what's the Kuznets hypothesis?
The Kuznets hypothesis, and I will introduce also the background like we did for Marx. The Kuznets hypothesis is that income inequality goes up under the influence of technological change, or it was in this case industrialization, where what happens, and implicitly Kuznets, I think, had in mind basically New England, where you have equal distribution of land assets, and then you actually have people who get attracted to go to the cities, to work in the cities for a wage. Now, that wage is higher than what you can make, staying in the countryside. So it pulls people out. Then on top of that, it actually has greater variety of jobs. So as you notice, there are two forces which push inequality up. One force is that people move towards the higher wage, and thereby they create a wedge between them and everybody else who stayed, in the countryside. Secondly, when they move to the city like New York or Baltimore or Philadelphia, they have a greater variety of occupations, so wage inequality or income inequality there rises. So that was his idea for the upswing. And the idea for the downswing was there will be greater amount of capital. Consequently, there will be the decline in the rate of profit. That's what practically everybody has, neoclassicals, Ricardo, Smith, Marx. And then on top of that, the population would get older. There will be greater demand for social transfers, and social policies would be directed towards the reduction of inequality. So he charts in very nice inverted U shape, where actually development itself kind of leads to the decline of inequality. First leads to an increase, and then to a decline.
And he was writing in the 60s, 70s in the US, right?
No, it's actually interesting. He was writing even in the 50s. And what I want to actually put Kuznets, like we did for Marx, in the context. And that also is very striking. He was starting working on income inequality in the US even in the late 40s. But the most famous article and then book was in the mid 50s. So think of the late 40s, mid 50s in the US in three levels. First, it was by far the richest and most powerful country in the world. In 52, US was producing 40% of global GDP. It is currently under 20%. So it was producing really like almost half of global GDP. Secondly, it was the country with the highest standard of living, which continued rising, I think, after the recession of 1937. It just kept on going, and during the war, it increased even very substantially. And then third, it was a country, very interestingly, that had a decline of inequality, again, probably after the Depression or probably in the 1930s, so much so that Arthur Burns, who was the founder of the National Bureau of Economic Research, writes to Kuznets saying, look, like in last 10 years, we have sort of traversed 1/3 of the road from inequality that we had in, I suppose, 39, I cannot remember what year exactly he said, until now, which means if we continue like that, we would be practically an almost equal society.
Which during a Cold War era, of course, is very nice to hear for an American.
It was very nice, of course, to say we're really reducing inequality, we have an increase in social mobility.
And by the way, is that something that's uncontroversial? Would everyone, would most observers of that era agree that this period was a time when genuinely all the boats were lifted, inequality was being reduced, and social mobility was increasing? How much is that up for debate?
On social mobility, I really don't know. And I don't think that we actually have the data of social mobility.
Okay.
But there is no doubt that the three elements that I mentioned, the uncontested global position of the United States as the most powerful country. Number two, highest standard of living in the world. Number three, significant reduction of inequality. Now, when you say Kuznets, and not you, but I say it also, Kuznets had an optimistic view of income, of the evolution of income inequality. And if you compare the framework of Marx in 1860 to Kuznets in 1950, Marx operates under entirely different conditions that we were just talking about.
So depressing you couldn't read it in middle school.
I couldn't read the book, So the fact that I'm not saying that we would explain different economists' views simply by the environment in which they work. There is much more complex than that. But there is no doubt that environment under which we live and work does influence our view of the world, simply because we try to make sense of it.
On Kuznets, nowadays it's very common to say that he was proven wrong by history, just as it's common to say that Marx was proven wrong by history. Before we get to that, though, I do want to say one thing, which is that I think so. I lived in China. I did my master's in Beida in Peking University.
This picture means
I do.
Wow, this is it's a great asset.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It's not near the level that I would like it to be, but anyway, having studied on a superficial level the Chinese economy a fair amount, I think it's just incredible how accurate Kuznets is about the development of China, like how he would have predicted the development of China. Because you have exactly the things you mentioned. You have, first of all, people start from a very egalitarian land, mostly peasant situation. Some move to the cities, so you get a massive difference between the cities and the countryside. And that in China is one of the most important explanations of inequalities. So you get this urban-rural gap, which is huge in China. And secondly, in China, the places where you have highest inequality are the cities.
Yeah.
Because there you have the bankers and the beggars. And so it's quite striking, actually. I don't know if how... I don't know what your take on it, but it does seem to be that it's just a perfect replication of what Kuznets suggested would happen when you start growing your economy from a agricultural to an industrial economy under capitalism.
I totally agree. I actually I disagree also with people who believe that Kuznets has now fallen out of favor and he was wrong.
Well, let's see why would people say that?
It's for the following reason. They take Kuznets' hypothesis. It was defined in 1955, as I explained, so there is no need to repeat it. Inequality goes up, goes down. And they say, oh, look, but advanced societies in the US, UK, most of Europe, and so forth, since 1980, have an increase. There is no doubt that there was an increase. And they say, did Kuznets predict that? And you say, well, no, he didn't predict because he stopped.
Before we go further, could you give some numbers?
So there are different numbers, okay? As you said, there are market income, there is gross income, there is a disposable income, there are household surveys, there are correction of household surveys for top incomes, there are fiscal data. So I will not go into this whole litany of issues. But let me just say that if we take standard international definition of income, which has been done by current population survey in the US since 1963. And if we take 1980 as the year where actually things started changing, which indeed it was the case, we had about 5 to 6 Gini point increase. 5 or 6 Gini point increase is a significant increase given that the original level was a Gini about 35.
Just to put some numbers in here, like Finland, Norway have like 26. And the most unequal countries in the world are
about 60.
Those would be like South Africa.
This would be Brazil, for example, okay. Colombia, Honduras. So basically, the US starts with 35, which is an average number for OECD countries. They all go up a little bit, but US goes up a little bit more, ends up currently at a Gini of 41, which is fairly unusually high for OECD countries that tend to be in about 35. So if there is an increase of that, then Kuznets' curve goes up, then goes down, then goes up again. And then they say, okay, well, this was wrong. But I think that reasonable interpretation of Kuznets could be that he saw the industrial change, transformation in the US, but he did not think of the new transformation that happened in the 80s with introduction of really labor-saving machines, with obviously globalization, with robotics. That was, you can actually argue, this is a new industrial revolution, which also pushes inequality up because there was an upswing where essentially large rents are being realized and kept. And then we would have to wait for political forces or for the redistribution of these rents to drive inequality down. So I don't think we can easily reject Kuznets simply based on the fact that he just described one segment. We could actually apply the same logic that he had to the other segment where you have another industrial revolution.
So now the US and other rich countries are transforming again, and therefore you again have a big wage gap between those that are benefiting from the transformation. So okay, now we're on a new upswing, but how optimistic are you that there will be a kind of natural downward sloping curve again?
Well, I actually see, I mean, now obviously we should not really overdo that, but we basically see since after the financial crisis, so it's essentially since 2008, we see US inequality not rising anymore. We see 1 year up and another year down, and UK is actually on the decline. So I would argue that we have already started possibly the downswing on the second Kuznets wave.
Yeah, there are many people who would hope that you are right in the rather optimistic view about this. There are people who, like Thomas Piketty, who would say that that is certainly not the natural next phase. I mean, if I understand Piketty's argument right, he would say that Kuznets actually misses the point, which is that there's nothing predetermined about this growth spurt first increasing but then decreasing inequality. Rather, it was just a very unique historical setting with two world wars that destroy a lot of the property of the rich people, a lot of the capital, together with social democracy, which was driven by the Cold War need to create an alternative to socialism. This was a very unique moment. And if you look, and we don't need to go into the laws, but just for listeners, I think like Piketty's basic idea is that if you look at certain kind of very fundamental laws in capitalism, they are bound to increase inequality kind of almost forever without these kind of external events that we experienced in the early 20th century. So where do you disagree with Piketty?
No, first of all, I liked very much the book, and I don't have a very strong disagreement. I actually the essential question that one has to ask oneself is: are there sort of internal, inherent forces within capitalism that would actually lead you to lead capitalists to reduce inequality? The forces of war are not obviously the inherent forces because really it's basically an exogenous force.
And we probably don't want to use that method to decrease inequality.
No, and we don't want to use that method, exactly. Then the question is actually, is policy that? And policy, in principle, could be, and as I said, it was used by Kuznets, it's also used by Piketty, because Piketty and Say's main argument is essentially, let's use policy, meaning taxation in particular case, to actually stop this natural tendency of capitalism to produce ever higher inequality. But there is also, one has also to admit that there could be endogenous forces, and I meant actual, one which was present even in Marx, and that was the decline in the rate of profit over a long time, and that could actually also mean, it doesn't necessarily mean, but it could also mean the reduction in the share of total GDP which belongs to capital, so in the capital share. So that would be an endogenous force. Another endogenous force could be greater ownership of capital assets. That also is possible. As people become richer, they invest and have more assets. And of course, Daniel Wardestrom was recently, he has a book now arguing that the middle class in Western countries, in terms of wealth, became much better off, in part because of pensions.
Do I understand the logic right that Piketty is worried that basically capital owners have more rapid growth of income than wage earners?
Yes.
But you're saying that, well, there's two ways to counteract that. One is if they don't have that much of a return, which could happen when you have a diminishing return on capital, or if we get more and more people to own capital via things like pension funds or people just deciding to invest their savings. Of course, they need to have some savings to invest first.
Right. So basically, I think what I want to say is that endogenous force of the reduction of inequality in Piketty is sort of shut off by the assumption that R is greater than G.
R being the return on...
I'm sorry, R being the return to capital and G being rate of growth of the economy, which is practically the income of everybody else, but people who actually own capital. That's obviously a crucial assumption. So if R cannot go down, then endogenously capitalism really is very unlikely or impossible to reduce inequality, because this R, which is already higher than the average rate of growth, is going to be received by people who are very rich. So you do have an inbuilt automatic transmission into higher inequality. Then the question becomes, how do we stop that? And as I was saying, okay, then we have a policy, and that's why Piketty and Size and Zuckman insist so much on policy, which is also interesting, because if policy is a tool, that means that the policy tools are not being entirely controlled by capital owners. So that becomes also interesting, because when we criticize capitalism, we often say that it is a plutocracy because the capitalists would never allow us to tax their capital. But if they believe that actually it is possible to do that, then implicitly capital owners are not sufficiently powerful to stop us from doing this.
What about global inequality? So I think I mentioned to you before the interview that I was recently writing a grant proposal where I just casually said that with the rising inequalities, local and global.
Yes, you did. Yeah.
Well, I did not check the data. Then I did check the data reading your book. And it's quite striking, actually. It depends a little bit on what metrics we look at. But
yeah, sure.
Is it roughly right to say that there's almost a opposite pattern, that if within rich countries inequality has been going down until the 60s, 70s, and then going up again, up a lot in the US, not much up in some other Western countries or Japan, but anyway, up a little bit. But on the other hand, the global inequality looks very different. So it's increasing pretty much until the 80s. And during the recent wave of globalization, whatever demerits globalization has had to ever, there has been a reduction in global inequality by most standards. Am I right?
Yes, I mean, this is such a complicated topic. We already had one very complex topic. We could move to another one. I agree with you. If you just superimpose two graphs, one global inequality going back in 1820, and superimpose to that the U.S. inequality, you really have like exactly almost the opposite move in the latter part of the first part of the 20th century. And in the rest of you have the decline of the U.S. inequality, you have increase in global inequality, then global inequality starts going down with China, essentially from 1980s, and U.S. inequality shoots up.
Is it just China? If you take China away from the picture, is there any more?
That's the big question. If you take China out, you still have a decline in global inequality.
Okay.
So that's a very important point. China is crucial. It drives that inequality down most significantly because, of course, it was a very poor country that became much less poor and pulled up 1.4 billion people. And then, of course, as they move through the distribution from poverty to sort of moderate prosperity, as it is called, or even some of them actually reach even the top 5% of the global income distribution, they reduced inequality. But even if you take China, and I've written about that, China out, you still have it. If you take India out, then you don't have it.
Wait, China and India out.
Yes, but you cannot kind of say, well, China and India is 3 billion people, but I'm going to take them out of calculation.
Yeah.
So, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
However, it makes sense in the following way that some people, and I think there is some truth to that as well, they say, yes, there is a global convergence, a global reduction of inequality, but not all parts of the world have converged. In other words, technically, ideally, you would love to see the world converging, whereby all parts of the world and practically most countries and all countries become more similar to each other and more similar to the rich West. Well, that has not happened in Africa, and it has barely happened in Latin America. So the convergence of the world, they say, and I think it's true technically, is a story basically of Asia catching up to the rich world, and very large countries in Asia being obviously China and India. So the story gets a little bit nuanced, and I agree with that story. And when I tend to present obviously the world as such without going into full comes from where, but that kind of, how should I say, more nuanced picture of global income distribution evolution is right.
So could I summarize then saying that that yes, if we take most standard inequality measures, it looks like global inequality has been coming down. But if we were to say compare the bottom 1% to the top 1%, we would probably have the opposite answer, and it would have grown a lot since the 80s.
It's yes, it probably did. I actually the share of the top 1% has not actually. It has gone up somewhat.
Okay, but not much. Interesting.
Yeah, not much. But interestingly, certainly not actually after 2008, the global financial crisis. Actually, the growth rate of the top has clearly decelerated. But it is also very tricky. Let me give you why. It's very complex. The bottom, what happened in the last 10 years? 10 years was really very interesting. It took me some time to understand. And what happened is that the Chinese, rural Chinese, who were part of the of the bottom quintile, which means the bottom 20% population. These rural Chinese, of whom there were 100 million there, because of the government action, as you know, Jinping has decided actually to eliminate rural poverty. So that policy basically moved everybody out of the bottom quintile. That meant that people who were many of the people who were above the bottom quintile, mostly Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India, they fell into the bottom quintile.
So their wages didn't fall, but their relative wages fell because the Chinese were lifted up.
Well, the Chinese evacuate that group, and you actually positionally go down. And then when you measure it, when I measure 2018 to 2008, what do I notice? I notice an increase in incomes of the bottom. But that increase is a little bit kind of strange because because these Indians just stayed at the same level or maybe slightly went up, but they were not in the previous quintile before. So when you look at them, you say, well, look, the poor people really gained 10%. But in reality, it is not true.
When it is the Chinese, it is just because of the Chinese gaining.
Yes. So, that's where the tricky part is. What you observe in global inequality is like the sea, the surface of the sea. So you see that surface, but what is happening below that surface? There is a permanent reshuffling. And I'm not only talking of people because obviously I don't know people, but I know percentiles of each country. So these percentiles reshuffle. And until you start really digging, and of course, I'm not digging for each percentile, but I was digging in this case because I saw something odd there. And then you realize, is this really the improvement of the poorest? It's kind of hard to say. Yes, it is an improvement, but it's improvement for the poorest Chinese, much more than for the poorest Indians. But there is much more stability at the top. The top is essentially still the West European, North American, because the China effect, which has been very strong at the bottom, as I just explained, then also strong in the middle, because many Chinese have actually overtaken lower parts of the income distribution of European countries. There is a China effect. But then at the very top, we don't really observe it because the very top is still largely dominated by the US, by the UK, Germany, Japan, large countries that are also rich.
If we look at these relative measures, on most of the measures, global inequality has actually decreased during globalization. But there are thinkers like Jason Hickel who suggest that this is a misleading picture, because we should really pay attention to the absolute amount of money that different people are getting. If you just plot a graph showing how much money the top percent, etc., gets, the richest people get so much of the new wealth that has been created that you barely see any budget in the lines of anyone else. Looking at those graphs, people tend to look at globalization saying, oh my God, it's only benefiting the rich. A 1% increase for a billionaire is so much more than a doubling for a poor.
Incomparable. And actually, many people don't know that because they are not aware of how high the differences are in absolute amounts, original amounts, especially the top. So it is true that in percentage terms, globalization has been how should I advanced up to globalization up to 2008 has been most beneficial for the incomes of the middle, which basically means the middle class in Asia. But in absolute terms, there is no doubt that it has been most advantageous to the very top of the income distribution that is composed of rich people in rich countries. And this is true. I agree, that statement is true. What is problematic there, that this is not how methodology of income inequality normally works. We work with relative measures. And the problem with absolute measures is the following. In the conditions where you have large increases in mean incomes, absolute measures tend always to give you increased distances between individuals.
It basically makes a trade-off between prosperity and equality almost by definition.
Yeah, I liken it to the balloon. If you have a small balloon, which is like small income of a country in Africa, let's suppose, put the dots on there. You just blow this balloon. Now, the distances between the dots, if you measure them in centimeters, or inches, are going to go up. The relative positions did not change. So the problem with it is accurate to say that if I take the entire gain of globalization as 100, a significant chunk of that, it could be like 30, went to the top of the income distribution. But it is also true to say that nor conventionally measured inequality with relative measures shows a decline. And the problem then with absolute measures becomes that we really lose sight of whether really inequality has risen or not, because we basically focus on what is the median or middle growth, which pushes everybody up and, of course, pushes the top as well.
I guess it's the nice thing about relative change is that if it does continue, it will eventually cause convergence.
Eventually, yes.
Maybe very slowly, but eventually.
So I would actually say, and in my most recent paper that actually gone through many revisions, I am using both measures. So it is true that we should use and have a more nuanced picture, but I have to underline that the use of absolute measures tends to produce absolute increases in inequality whenever the mean income is significantly rising.
Mm-hmm. You have a book called Capitalism Alone, where you chart the development of capitalism, suggesting, if I may summarize it, that there are no viable alternatives to capitalism at the moment. There are different versions of capitalism, social, democratic, liberal, etc. I don't know many people who would want to go back to Soviet Union economics. I don't know many people who want to go back to Maoist economics. But I do think that it's very striking how little Yugoslavia is discussed. And Yugoslavia is one of these examples where it isn't quite as painfully obvious that communism failed. You had less state intervention, you had worker ownership, you had a small entrepreneurship was allowed, but when it was a bigger factory, the workers had the right to make decisions, etc. I mean, it on the very superficial level, it looks like this might have been a much nicer thing, and they had a lot of growth, right? Similar growth rates as Italy for a lot of the time after the Second World War.
Yes.
So you're perhaps the person who most want to ask this question: is Yugoslavia in some kind of honed version a reasonable challenge to capitalism?
Well, okay, it's a very difficult question. The collapse of the Yugoslav example in people's perception comes largely from the breakup of Yugoslavia from the war. But if you go back and look at how the system functioned, it had certainly some features which are even being replicated, and there are attempts to replicate them in developed countries, which means much greater role in decision making by workers. The introduction, as Germany had it with co-determination, introduction of workers in decision making. So Yugoslavia did have that, and when people have actually lived there, I know that it did actually function. In smaller socially owned enterprises, it functioned more or less as it was supposed to be on paper. In larger enterprises, there it didn't function exactly the way it should have, because the government then appointed, although it was voted by the Workers' Council, but was really appointed by the government authorities, people whom they believed were trustworthy. They were, of course, important Communist Party members and so on. However, within the enterprise, each enterprise, there were always, how should I say, democratic tensions. So it is really not true that there was no sort of democratic decision making. However, there are other problems which exist in the Yugoslav model without going through all of them. One of them being that when workers had much greater say, they also tended to privilege themselves. So, for example, if company invests and I'm about to retire and you're a young worker, and we have an extra 100 dinars to invest, I, as a worker who is going to retire, have no incentive in investing into that company, because I am retiring. I have no share to take out of the company.
Oh, interesting. So the level of investment smaller, people just take it to their pockets.
Yes, people wanted actually very often to invest less than in a corresponding capitalist company, because for workers, particularly workers who are older or workers who are actually planning to leave, there is nothing to gain from that. For you, maybe you're a young worker and maybe there'll be a better investment and eventually you would recoup that through your wage. But for me, as an older worker going to pension, whether that company would become efficient or not efficient is a matter of indifference. So there were actually several, I will not go over through this, even they have their own names, but there were several technical issues. And if you look at the cooperatives in the West, particularly in northern Italy and Mondragon, they also had the same problem. And then they eventually ended up by introducing limited shares, and actually, very paradoxically, introduced a worker force that did not have the same right as the original worker. So there are many issues. I'm not, as I said, one should not dismiss that model, because it has certain democratic advantages. But there are genuine, legitimate problems that have been noticed not only in the Yugoslav case, but in kibbutz case, in Mondragon, in the cooperatives in the U.S., and employee stock ownership plans. So really, one has to think maybe more creatively about how to solve them.
And Yugoslavia did have a pretty tough time economically, right, in the 80s, even before the collapse.
The 80s were a disaster because the 80s was the beginning of the breakup because of the inability of Yugoslavia to repay foreign debt. The 70s were the golden age because Yugoslav system was relatively efficient, certainly much more efficient than centrally planned, and actually gave much greater ability to purchase, obviously, consumer goods, to travel abroad. Actually, as you know, 1.5 million people worked abroad, which is not exactly a good recommendation for the Yugoslav system. They worked mostly in Germany and Sweden and Switzerland. The Yugoslav group was the largest group before the Turkish sort of became the largest in West Germany of foreign workers. But then that was based to some extent, significant extent, on easy borrowing from 73 to 1980. When the crisis hit in 1980, as it hit Yugoslavia the same way that it hit Brazil and Latin America and also Poland, these countries really could not return to that. And then it was actually zero growth for 10 years and eventually the war. There are people who believe that this zero growth of 10 years had a significant contribution to political instability. So that was but I would not want to go into political issues because we really want to discuss, and I think we did, actually, economic performance of the system.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, thank you for sharing those insights. My final question to all guests is, how has your research shaped your outlook on humanity?
Well, this is really a difficult one. Maybe, what shaped my outlook on humanity was more historical studies. And even that's the latest book, The Visions of Inequality, is basically a historical study. So it has shaped it in a way that I think I understand much better what we talked about before, how our views are determined or influenced significantly by the place where we live, born, or interested. And then, interestingly, I think actually the book made me also realize how our view of cleavages, the key cleavages in society, evolves. I start with Quenet, where the key cleavage was legally defined groups. As you know, before the Revolution of France, they were estates, so they were legally different. Aristocracy, clergy, and etc. were different. And then Smith, Ricardo, and Marx see, of course, classes as defined by the access to the means of production. And then you have Pareto, and we didn't talk about Pareto, which I regret, but we'll maybe talk next time, who sees the elite as basically, the elite could be bourgeois elite or could be future bureaucratic elite or was aristocratic elite, but there is always an elite. Today in the US, it's meritocracy. It's the elite that basically controls both capital and labor, which I call homoplutia. And Pareto would be very much at ease. He says, yes, you have an elite. In the US, it's 1%, and there is everybody else. And then you have Kuznets that we talked about, the distinction between urban workers and rural workers and manufacturing versus agriculture. Now we come to actually realizing there are certain markers we didn't think much before, but we now see them much more dramatically. Gender, on which all the authors that I mentioned wrote sporadically and very little. Race, which also they knew and they wrote, but again, not to the extent that we believe nowadays it determines, particularly in racially or ethnically divided society, it can determine outcomes. So we actually see new markers now. And then finally, to answer your question, maybe about in the following sense, I would say that it makes you also wonder, what are the markers that exist today and that we are unable to see? And maybe that the future generation, yours, or in 50 years, somebody would say, well, you were kind of blind. Didn't you see that there were such markers that were there that made a difference in access to income or wealth, and you didn't study them? And that was, the history, I think, is useful to it's useful in general, but I think it's especially useful to the extent that it makes you think from the future point of view, what you are missing. And in that, because you look at the past and say, well, how could they have not seen that? Well, you are not smarter than them. Somebody would say the same thing to you.
Professor Branko Milanović, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was one of the best conversations. So it was excellent. Your questions were excellent.
So that was it for today. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please do consider supporting my work. First by subscribing to the podcast if you have not done so yet, and also by becoming a Patreon member at patreon.com/onhumans. Do also check out the OnHumans newsletter at onhumans.substack.com, where you can read breakdowns and analysis of each episode. That can be a great way also to just refreshing your memory if there's an episode that you really liked but start forgetting what exactly was it about. Anyway, until next time, take care.